Hello, thank you for checking out this video. I'm pleased to be here today to be talking about a little project I'm working on called ExternalData. It's a tool that can be used with Azure Sentinel or log analytics workspaces, and primarily it's used to kind of solve a problem on operationalizing against archived logs that are sent to blob storage accounts. So we're going to dive into this in just a moment. Again, just want to thank you. My name is Nathan Swift. I'm a security cloud solution architect. Let's go ahead and dive right into the tooling and what it's trying to solve. So what we have here is a perfectly kind of natural way to archive your data, basically deduping your Azure Sentinel logs as they're coming into a log analytics workspace. And so as you set up data connectors and start bringing data in, you can use what's called a data export rule that allows you to dedupe that data in the ingestion pipeline and send it either to an Azure Event Hub that can be then used to SIEM that's on-prem or a SIEM in the cloud, or Azure Data Explorer for long-term retention and lookup, or it can also be sent for long-term retention and lookup in an Azure Storage account as blobs. And so that Azure Sentinel data export rule, we'll take a quick look at it to simply deploy that and to start exporting your Azure Sentinel logs. You can use an Azure Resource Manager template, and those can be found in the Azure Docs. I've got one already loaded up here. And you'll see that you'll go ahead and put that into a storage account that you want to send the logs into, and then specifically what type of tables that you want to archive. Now, at the time of this recording, not all tables can be exported. For instance, custom logs, anything with an _CL cannot be exported with the data export rule. That will probably be coming in the future. There's a couple other logs, but by far and large, many of those log types, Ceph formatted firewall logs, Azure AD sign-in logs, Office activity logs, you name it, can be exported with this data export rule. This data export rule is very easy to use, and it's a very natural way to bring that data, deduping it again, into Azure Sentinel or into the blob storage account. Now, when that data is exported into the blob storage account, it goes into a format like this. You're going to be pointing it to a storage account, and it's going to auto create the containers for each type of table name. So you're going to get an AM-email events, or an AM-office activity, or an AM-common security log for your firewall logs. So I'm going to just jump into one of these guys here, email events. And you'll see here that the way that the data export rule works is it starts nesting it into the workspace name, and then specifically year, months, dates, and then every hour it's going to roll over to a new container spot. And then within that, you're going to get what are called, it's going to be a JSON file, a blob, and it's an append blob. So what that means, right, is the logging file gets deduped and generated in the storage account. It's an append blob, meaning that it's going to continue inserting data, JSON data, into this JSON file over time until the next hour is reached and it rolls over into the next log. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and quickly download this file and open it up. And you'll see here that in just a moment that the file itself, again, is going to be in a declarative JSON. And we have each row or instance of that data occurring in JSON format. Now, this is really kind of hard and difficult to query off of or use, right, in a visual codes editor or a text editor. Certainly you can do Control F and look for things. But what we want to do here is specifically operationalize it against our existing assets in Azure Sentinel. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you that this file itself can be called by generating a SAS key, and we can easily create a read key here for the next little bit, and it's going to generate a blob SAS URL. Now I'm going to copy this blob SAS URL, and for quick purposes, so that I don't forget this, I'm going to paste this into a notepad. And with that blob SAS URL, you can go ahead and query that from any Log Analytics workspace, any Azure Data Explorer cluster that you have out there, including Azure Sentinel. So what that would look like, for instance, is using a KQL command called ExternalData, providing the schema of the external data table that we want to look up, and then a reference to the blob files that we want to look up, including the SAS URL that allows an external system like Azure Sentinel to look up that log file in a blob storage account that's protected with private access. That's why we're generating that SAS URL. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into a Log Analytics workspace here. I'm going to go to Logs, and I'm going to go ahead and pop in the KQL command. And that KQL command is going to be external data. And it's going to then open a parentheses and then use each schema field that's going to be available. We're going to supply with it the SAS URL that we are just generated in quotation marks. And then last, we'll probably define, define that it's using JSON. So with JSON. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this guy here. And what I'm doing here is there's one last little command to tell it basically that the file itself is JSON. If it's not JSON, it can also read CSV. It can read other types of formats as well too in the language. There we go. So it's with format equals JSON. So let me go ahead and copy that in there. Go ahead and run this. And lo and behold, here are the logs and the rows of data that I have for that particular date timestamp. Now, as you could imagine, if you're trying to operationalize this, especially if you're sending this data into blob storage for long-term retention, maybe beyond 90 days, and then beyond that, 6 months and later, you need to have that data there for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and you have a historical need to kind of look that up. Well, diving into each file, specifically when you start thinking about the dates and time ranges that you might need to historically look up, would be very difficult to kind of do by generating that SAS URL through each hour folder that you're seeing in there, right? So in order to speed that up, what I've done is I've created a PowerShell script that I've uploaded to Azure Sentinel's GitHub, and the PowerShell script will help solve this much faster. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and plug this in here. So I'm going to go ahead and run the PowerShell script. First thing it's going to ask for is the Azure Sentinel workspace that you want to look up the logs on. The second thing that it's going to ask for is the storage account, and the storage account that it's going to have to look up the logs on. And so in our case, that is SimPipe storage account. It's also going to ask what type of table name to export. And we're going to do the email events table name. Then we're going to do a start and stop date format for starting the date that we want to start looking up the logs. So on September 11th at 2 a.m. And then the stop, when we want to stop looking up those logs. In this case, September 12th, I've got a request to look at the 11th through the 12th, some email message trace logs, for instance. And so once I fill in this data, it's going to go ahead and start finding all of the blobs that are in the storage account for the archived events between those date ranges. It's going to generate a SAS signature for each date range. It's going to go ahead and look up the email events table and generate the schema for me. And it's going to give me basically a base KQL that I can then use in my operations for compliance reasons to look up that data. And so now I can go ahead and copy and paste that in. Let me jump back over to Log Analytics, and we're going to do logs here. And once this comes up, we're going to go ahead and search with that base KQL query that the Powershell script had given for me. Go ahead and paste that guy in. And it's also going to generate those SAS URLs for each blob file with 8 hours of access. So go ahead and run this guy here. And now I've got the results from the historical time ranges that I'm looking for. And just like typical KQL, I can then go ahead and start doing wheres, summarizations, other KQL commands that would be very helpful to help me kind of search or summarize some data that was occurring in the past for audit and compliance reasons. So maybe I need to look for where delivery action was blocked, for instance, or had failed. So we'll just say failed here. And sure enough, we'll go ahead and get the results back. Now, one thing to note with the command here is that you're calling your external lookup data, and the data that is being looked up, right, is in a storage account external to the log analytics cluster. There we go. Using the wrong column. So delivery action has been blocked. And now I'm looking at the blocked, and if I wanted to further, I could say delivery location equals failed. The key here, right, is the records that are being looked up. Because it's on a blob storage account, it's not in the log analytics cluster. Your performance for the query and the more data that you bring in will have some types of performance limitations on it, performance hits on it, and then ultimately some limitations eventually if you're calling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records of rows from a storage account across multiple files. At some point, it may fall down. That query may fall down on its face, right? Because it's not part of log analytics. It's not in cached mode. It's not in that Custo cluster, cached and ready to go, highly indexed and searchable, right? It's going out and looking for the file, for that SAS URL, and then bringing that data in. So there's a bit of a performance hit for that. But for cost effectiveness, this is a very cost effective way to bring your data, dedupe it, send the data into Azure Storage accounts, and then in addition to that, be able to operationalize and look up that data later if needed. Now, the Powershell script and even the external data sources and schemas are uploaded and available in Azure Sentinel today. So under Azure Sentinel, under the Tools folder, you can go into the External Data project that we have here. And in the External Data project, you can learn a little bit more about that. You can also look about setting up a data export rule for your Azure Sentinel Log Analytics workspace. And be careful when you click on this because there are two templates that are available. One is to the storage account, which is great. The other one is to the event hub that you can copy and bring into a custom template deployment. Now, in addition to that, the Powershell script is available here as well. Feel free to look at the code. I'm going to be looking at some different ways to improve it. over time and eventually make it into just the commandlet. The other idea that I have too that some colleagues of mine, Rin, has kind of asked me to do is think about it as a notebook, right? So in a notebook, you bring up your Azure Sentinel incident, and then you want to use some of this script and stuff to look back in the past as you're investigating an incident, and you want to look at the raw logs in the past that are no longer on the Azure Sentinel workspace but are archived in blob storage. So it'd be kind of a natural notebook kind of workflow in Python or PowerShell to kind of work with that. And then finally, in addition to the script, you can see the beginnings of each different type of table being exported with its schema and a sample of what that KQL would look like. So in this case, we were testing email events, and we can see that the schema is there. And then also other schemas as well. Maybe you're looking at firewall logs in the past that have been archived and you want to look at that data. So again, it's another great place to just be able to get the base KQL query and the schema involved with the external data lookup, but then also to use that PowerShell script as well too to help with operationalizing against that. So hopefully this has been really helpful, just walking through the concept of deduping using an Azure data export rule on your Azure Sentinel workspace to dedupe those logs into a blob storage account for cost purposes, but then also to operationalize when you audit or compliance eventually comes back and says, hey, we need to look at logs from like 2 years ago or 8 months ago. That data may not be in your Azure Sentinel workspace based on your retention policy settings. And so this PowerShell script and the KQL based schemas that are in this tools external data project will help you to operationalize against this. So again, thank you for your time, and feel free to drop any questions or comments below. Thank you and have a wonderful day.